John Harkness held honor, duty, and integrity in high regard. Growing up in a small town, he learned the value of hard work while assisting his father at their family-run auto repair shop. His father, a Korean War veteran, instilled in him a deep respect for service, an ideal John carried throughout his life. After high school, he joined the Marines, quickly gaining a reputation for toughness and leadership. John's life took a turn when he met Julie, a paralegal. They fell in love, got married, and built a life together founded on love and trust. But when the Vietnam War broke out, John felt a strong urge to serve. Despite being a reservist, he volunteered for deployment, putting their plans for starting a family on hold. Julie supported his decision, though it weighed heavily on both of them. Years later, John reflected on their 50-year journey together as he got a tattoo in her honor, only his second one ever. John excelled both as a mechanic and a Marine, and he believed that reservists like himself should share the burden of the Vietnam War, even though they weren't being called up due to the high number of draftees. In March 1967, after 3 years of marriage and having recently bought a house, he discussed his decision to volunteer with Julie, who worked at a local law firm. It was a difficult conversation, but they were financially secure, and John assured her they'd manage. Julie, though tearful, understood John's strong sense of duty. At 6A, John was tough, but marriage had softened his rough edges. The night before he left, they shared an emotional farewell. "Come back to me safe and sound," Julie urged. "Remember, you're mine," John chuckled. "Don't worry, honey. Honey. I'll take care of myself. Just behave while I'm gone," she smiled and replied, "I promise to be good." Before heading to Vietnam, John updated his will and arranged for part of his $40.60 monthly salary as an E-4 to be directed towards their mortgage. Half of his pay covered the house, while a quarter went into their joint account for utilities. John figured he wouldn't need much and hoped hazard pay would cover any extras. He did, however, indulge in one thing before he left: a tattoo of a knife with the words "death before dishonor." He considered adding a rose with a name, but remembered his father's advice and decided against it. In Vietnam, John was assigned as a fire team commander in a Marine battalion. Initially, the regular Marines were skeptical of him as a reservist, but he quickly earned their respect in combat. Unlike some soldiers, John kept his distance from the local women, not just because he was devoted to Julie, but also out of fear of diseases. "Come on, man, it's Vietnam," Harker, a fellow corporal, teased him. John showed him a picture of Julie. "Not with her waiting for me," he replied. Harker laughed. "Beautiful. But you know about Jody," referring to the slang for men who seduced soldiers' wives. John shook his head, confident. "Not Julie. She'd never do that." As the weeks went by, John wrote to Julie often and cherished her letters, reading them repeatedly. At first she wrote every 2 weeks, but then the letters became less frequent. John didn't worry initially, thinking the delays might be due to their unit's movements, but he found it odd that he heard from his parents more often than from her. One day he received photos of Julie in a swimsuit, but he didn't recognize the swimsuit or know who took the pictures. He brushed it off, focusing on the war and his responsibilities, but as Christmas passed without a word from Julie, John grew concerned, though he pushed the thoughts aside. By January 1968, his unit was near Da Nang, where rumors of a significant enemy offensive for Tet circulated. At the end of the month, the enemy launched an attack early in the morning, and John's position was overrun. Most of his team, including Harker, was killed, and John was severely wounded. He was evacuated to a naval hospital in Da Nang before being transferred to San Francisco. Doctors saved his leg, and though a bullet had narrowly missed his vital organs, he faced a lengthy recovery. His ear was permanently damaged, and he bore a scar on his cheek. A Marine officer presented him with a Purple Heart and informed him that he was being recommended for the Silver Star, adding to his other commendations. Tragically, Jennings, the only other survivor from his team, succumbed to his injuries. John's parents met him in San Francisco, but Julie was not there. When John inquired about her, his father hesitated before revealing that they hadn't seen her in weeks. He explained that the last time he had seen Julie was about 2.5 months earlier, when he noticed a man leaving John's house in a sports car while Julie waved from the doorway in a robe. Since that time, she had not returned calls or been at home. His father apologized, saying he had been collecting the mail and newspapers in her absence. John was devastated. He had been so sure of Julie's loyalty, but Harker's warnings about Jody now made sense. He finally understood why she had stopped writing. Was it a blue Corvette, John asked. Bob nodded. Yes, why it belongs to Eric Swagman, a junior partner at her firm, John explained. So she's not even around to get the mail, doesn't seem like it, Bob said. I noticed final notices for utilities and the phone, so I paid them. I thought you wouldn't want to come home to no power or phone, thanks, Dad John replied. I'll pay you back when I can. Don't worry about it. Just focus on getting better. I can set up a power of attorney for you. If she hasn't been paying the bills, who knows what else she's done, maybe even emptied your accounts. John called a nurse over to arrange a meeting with a military lawyer. A naval lieutenant commander soon arrived, took notes, and prepared the necessary paperwork. I'll handle the documentation for you, Corporal, the officer assured. Your parents will have power of attorney. I recommend contacting a family lawyer as soon as possible. We'll meet this afternoon to sign everything, thank you, Sir John replied. After the lawyer left, Bob reassured him, once we're back home, I'll check the bank and stop by the house. I still have the key you gave me. If you want, I can ask George Williams for help. He's retired now and does private investigations. He owes me a few favors, Bob offered. John hesitated. I'm not sure I can afford a private investigator, Dad. Don't worry about the cost. George and I go way back. I can also reach out to our family lawyer, Bob reassured him. Oh, by the way, Wilkins mentioned your spot is still open at the workshop. He's been saving part of your salary as a bonus for when you return. Just keep that between us. John felt touched by Wilkins' gesture. Wilkins, though usually gruff, had a kind heart beneath his tough exterior, always treating customers fairly. That sounds good, Dad John said, wiping away a tear, silently cursing Julie. His parents embraced him. Everything will be okay, son, his mother comforted him. A few hours later, the lawyer returned with a notary, and after signing the necessary papers, John's parents left, promising to keep him updated. They thanked the nurse, who assured them John was in good hands and would soon transfer to a VA hospital for physical therapy. Once alone, John finally managed to sleep, but his dreams weren't about Julie. Instead, he saw his fire team, their faces scarred but gathered around a fire as they used to. I'm sorry I couldn't bring you all back, John said. Harker smiled, lighting a cigarette. It's all right, Corporal. You did what you could. Besides, there's no Charlie where we are now, Jennings nodded in agreement. He's right, Corporal. It's a miracle any of us made it out, Johansson chimed in. Yeah, it was only 10,000 of them against the 4 of us, right, Trillo chuckled. I think we took out about 9,000 of them. The group laughed, but then Harker grew serious. You've got another fight ahead, brother. We all know it. And about Jody. Yeah, I was joking back then, but you've got to handle him, the others nodded in agreement. We might not be there physically, but we're with you in spirit, Johansson added. Thanks, guys, John said. See you, Harker replied with a smile. John woke up drenched in sweat. The dream had felt incredibly vivid, especially Harker's words. He knew he had to act, but he needed more information first. A few days later, John received a call from his father. I've got bad news, John Bob began. Julie cleaned out both your checking and savings accounts, leaving just $5. She also withdrew $854 from her own account in cash 2 months ago. The only deposits were your military pay, which she took out after each payday. Okay, Dad John replied. You have power of attorney. Remove her name from the account. We don't have credit cards, so that's one less thing to worry about. I'll take care of it. I also checked the house. It's a mess. There's spoiled food, dirty dishes, and a terrible smell. She took almost everything except her wedding dress, our photo album, and her rings, which I found thrown in the bathroom trash. At least the house is still standing, John said. Yes, but the bed is filthy. I bet she brought her lover there. What do you want me to do? Get rid of it, John instructed. Break it down and toss it. I'll sleep on a cot if I have to. We'll handle it, Bob agreed. By the way, George offered to help for free. He said nothing's worse than taking a soldier's wife while he's at war. I also found a lawyer willing to handle your divorce without charge. He can't stand Swagman. George suggests we change the locks, and I think it's a good idea. Go ahead, John replied. How are you holding up, Bob asked. I'm all right, really, John responded. Who are you trying to convince, me or yourself, Bob asked knowingly. "Dad, you lost people in battle, right?" Of course, Bob replied, understanding the weight behind the question. As a second lieutenant in the 1st Marine Regiment under Colonel Chesty Puller during the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in 1950, he was no stranger to loss. "Have you ever had dreams where they talk to you?" John asked. "Yeah, almost every night at first, but they fade over time," Bob answered. "Did you ever get over it?" "You never completely get over it, son. It becomes a part of who you are. You learn to live with it, or it'll consume you," Bob replied. The next 2 weeks flew by for John, with his parents calling almost daily with updates. They informed him that Julie had moved in with Eric Swagman and was now pregnant by him. Their relationship was no secret at her workplace. John's lawyer, Mike McGregor, filed for divorce, citing infidelity and abandonment, along with a restraining order against Eric. Mike also considered taking legal action against Julie's employer for breaching their moral code and planned to file complaints with the state bar using evidence George gathered. Julie was livid when she found out she could no longer access John's military paycheck account. She called his parents in a rage, but they told her to ask Eric for money. She was also furious when her house keys no longer worked, but they reminded her she no longer lived there. John found it amusing and concentrated on his physical and psychological recovery. Physically, he was mending, learning to walk with a cane and crutch. Mentally, he struggled with both the loss of his Marines and Julie's betrayal. When the cast was removed, John asked the doctor if he could drive, and the doctor told him he could, as long as the vehicle was automatic. As John was being wheeled back to his room, he noticed an orderly hanging up his uniform, now with sergeant stripes. The doctor came in and explained, "You've been promoted to sergeant, and you're discharged. You'll continue your physical therapy at a VA facility near home, but don't overdo it with your leg for now. Let's get you dressed, and we'll head to the break room." John found his freshly cleaned uniform still bearing corporal stripes. After getting dressed, a nurse helped him with his polished boots. Using a cane, John was guided to his wheelchair and taken to the break room, where he was met with a surprise. His parents, doctors, nurses, and Lieutenant Colonel Arvin Johnson, his reserve battalion commander, were all waiting for him. The colonel gestured for John to come forward, and John surprised everyone by standing with his cane. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson smiled, shook his hand, and read the promotion order, officially making John a sergeant in the Marine Corps Reserves, adding, "And may God have mercy on your soul," which drew laughter. John's parents proudly removed his old insignia and pinned on the new stripes. Then Lieutenant Colonel Johnson read another citation, presenting John with the Silver Star for his heroism during the Tet Offensive on January 30th, 1968. Corporal Harkness had led his small team of Marines against a superior enemy force near Da Nang, continuing to fight despite his injuries and ordering his men to hold their position. His leadership and bravery had played a crucial role in defending Da Nang, earning him the Silver Star. The colonel pinned the medal to John's chest and shook his hand. "God bless you, son. Your experience will be invaluable for training our men." John's mother embraced him, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she said. Bob wiped away a tear and shook John's hand. "Me too, son." After packing up his belongings, John changed into his Class C uniform, khaki shirt and green pants, since Marines couldn't wear green off base. He met his parents, and they headed to the airport. When they arrived home, John no longer saw it as a place of comfort after Julie's betrayal, but he appreciated the privacy it offered. His parents stocked the fridge with beer and snacks, and his mom prepared all his favorite meals, including lasagna. John changed into jeans and a t-shirt, unpacking his belongings. At the bottom of his bag he found something he had almost forgotten, a large Bowie knife he had come across in Vietnam. The worn scabbard bore the image of a winged creature holding a sword, with faint markings that looked like March ochre. Unsure of its origin, John treasured it as a keepsake and planned to research it further later on. He called his lawyer and George, arranging a meeting at his place. After resting, he decided to check on his prized pickup truck, which was still in the garage and in good condition. He checked the fluids and managed to get it started after a few tries, letting the engine purr smoothly. He planned to change the oil and give it a tune-up soon. After surveying his property, John grabbed a beer and sat in a rocking chair, his leg aching. He relaxed with the TV on for background noise, eventually settling on a game show he didn't recognize. He then called Wilkins to let him know he was back. About time, Wilkins barked. When can you start? John explained his situation with Julie and his need for physical therapy. Take all the time you need, son. Just glad you're back. The guys here could use your expertise. Drop by this week, I have a little welcome back gift for you. I'll be there, John replied before ending the call. Later, Mike and George arrived. John welcomed them, offered beers, and they settled in the living room. Good to see you, George said. Congrats on your award, you've earned it. Now, let's get down to business. He pulled out a reel-to-reel recorder. I've been keeping an eye on Julie and Eric. One night I followed them to a steakhouse, got a seat nearby, and recorded their conversation. George played the tape, and Eric's voice came through first. So Julie, have you thought about my proposal? I don't know, Eric. It's bad enough I cheated on John and I'm pregnant with your child. I just don't think I can convince him, Julie replied. Come on, baby. If anyone can, it's you. He's probably desperate right now, willing to do anything to take you back, Eric responded smugly. You don't know John. He'd never agree to raise this child or share me with you, Julie insisted. No, we won't let him get to you. I'm not interested in being a dad. John would do a better job raising the kid. If he doesn't go along with it, we'll threaten him with divorce, take his house, half his income, and demand alimony and child support. I've already got the paperwork ready, Eric said. George paused the tape. Do they really think you'd let that happen? John asked, stunned. There's more, George said, restarting the recording. I don't know, Eric. John won't go for this, Julie said again. He's still head over heels for you. He'll do anything, Eric said, pressing. Unless you still have feelings for him. I do, but not like before. Besides, you're better in bed, Julie replied. John flushed, feeling bitter at how much he had loved such a deceitful woman. I wouldn't have left you for Vietnam. What kind of idiot does that? Eric sneered. John clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. You're right, Julie agreed. I'll talk to him when he gets back. Good. Do you know when that will be? Eric asked. No, I haven't heard from him since January, and I haven't sent him anything since last year like you suggested, Julie answered. If he's stubborn, we have other ways to push him, Eric hinted. Like what? Julie asked, sounding nervous. Houses can catch fire, brakes can fail, Eric replied. You're not planning to hurt him, are you? Julie asked, worried. I won't support that. Don't worry, you won't be involved. If something happens, you get everything and you're free, Eric assured her. Only as a last resort, Julie conceded. Exactly. We'll see when he gets back, Eric finished. George turned off the tape. That's a conspiracy to commit murder, John said, shocked. George and Mike nodded. It could also be conspiracy to commit fraud and theft, given that Julie drained your accounts, Mike added. I filed papers on my way here and got an expedited hearing. Plus, there's a restraining order keeping them 100 feet away from you, your home and your parents. I spoke to the district attorney. They're preparing a criminal case. I also talked to a senior partner at their firm who's furious about this. We're filing a lawsuit against the firm for breaching their moral standards. By the end of this, Swagman could end up behind bars, George added. Your dad and I have friends in the department, including the chief. They'll be looking out for you. Any questions? George asked. Yeah, John replied. What should I ask for in the divorce? Mike handed John a folder. Your dad acted on your behalf. We're filing for divorce due to infidelity and abandonment. Since she earns more, there's no alimony. You keep the house and everything in it because she left and stopped paying the bills. We're also demanding $7,100 to cover her share of joint expenses. Plus the return of her rings and a name change back to her maiden name. She keeps only her clothes and car. We're suing Swagman for $800,000 and the firm for $2 million for their role. They might settle for half to avoid bad press. One more thing, do you have a dress uniform? Mike asked. Yes, John replied. Good. Get it dry cleaned and attach your medals. I want you to wear it in court so everyone sees who Julie and Eric betrayed. I have a surprise for them, but I'll reveal it later. Just let me know when, John said. Will do, Mike replied. Now, get some rest. "I think I'll grab a beer and see if I bump into any old friends," John said. "Be careful," George warned. "This area has gotten rougher, but not worse than Da Nang," John joked, and they all shared a laugh. Not quite, George chuckled, but close. After George and Mike left, John went to his room to change shirts. He thought about the knife, grabbed it, and hoped to find a friend who knew more about it. He locked the house, walked to the garage, and started his truck. "Damn, this feels good," he thought as the engine roared to life. He drove to one of his old hangouts, stopping for gas along the way. He parked outside the familiar bar and took in his surroundings. George was right, the place had grown a little rougher since he was last here. "I've seen worse," he thought, stepping into the bar through a haze of cigarette smoke. After ordering a beer, he scanned the room for familiar faces but didn't recognize anyone. The bar, once a place where regulars like John gathered for friendly chats over drinks, now seemed like a hangout for local troublemakers. After finishing his beer, he walked back to his truck. As he passed a dark alley, he thought he heard a woman's scream for help. He paused, listening intently, and the desperate plea echoed through the narrow space. "Please, stop," a woman's voice cried out, followed by laughter and foul language. As his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he saw a young woman surrounded by 5 or 6 thin men. It was clear that if no one intervened, they intended to harm her. John reached into his truck, pulling out a tool for protection, tucking it into the back of his waistband. He left his cane behind, knowing he would need both hands free, and crept toward the scene. As he got closer, he saw one of the men yank at the woman's dress, tearing it and exposing her as she screamed. It was time to act. "Hey," John shouted. "Leave her alone." "Didn't you hear?" she said. The men turned to him, startled by the sight of the scarred man in their alley. One of them stepped forward cautiously, brandishing a switchblade with a click, clearly expecting John to retreat. John chuckled and pulled out his own knife. The man's eyes widened at the sight of it. "You sure you want to go through with this?" John asked, his voice steady, hoping to defuse the situation. But the man twisted his knife and tried to move into a position between John and his friends, but John saw through the ploy and shifted to block him. The man lunged forward, but John sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and with a quick twist, the knife fell to the ground as the man howled in pain. John's swift actions threw the rest of the group off balance. They hesitated, then most of them ran, but 2 remained, determined to confront him. Unfortunately, John didn't notice the figure sneaking up behind him with a large wooden board, a rusty nail jutting from its edge. "Watch out behind you!" the woman cried. John turned just in time to see the board swinging toward him, and then everything went black as it struck the side of his head. He crumpled to the ground, bracing for another blow, but the attacker dropped the board and ran as flashing red and blue lights illuminated the alley's entrance. John struggled to sit up as a police officer approached. "Didn't George warn you this place was rough?" the cop asked, smirking. "Yeah," John muttered, holding his head. "Guess I'm too stubborn to listen." The officer surveyed the scene and instructed his partner to call for a couple of ambulances. Then, grabbing 2 more pairs of handcuffs, he secured the men on the ground. He noticed John's large knife nearby. "Now that's a knife," he remarked, picking it up. "Where'd you get this?" "Picked it up in Vietnam," John replied. "Hand it over," the officer said. "Got a case for it." John pulled out the leather sheath and handed it over. The officer examined it closely. "French Foreign Legion, huh? The symbol means march or die, it's not standard issue." "Bet this belonged to a French soldier once," he said, passing it back. "Better keep it safe before some tough cop confiscates it, maybe hang it in a frame." "Yeah, I'll do that," John replied. The young woman, still trembling, approached the officer. "Please don't arrest him, officer," she pleaded. "He saved my life. They were going to hurt me." The officer glanced at her torn dress. "He's not under arrest, ma'am, but he needs a doctor, and we'll need your statement." "I'll drive him to the ER myself and give my statement there," she offered. The officer considered for a moment before nodding in agreement. "All right, you can follow me to the hospital," he said, calling over to his partner. Another officer joined them, looking at the restrained men. "Isn't this Juan Mendoza, the gang leader?" he asked, astonished. The first cop nodded. "Yeah, that's him, and this guy took them down," he said, gesturing toward John. Damn, the second officer muttered. By then, ambulances had arrived, and paramedics were loading the gang members onto stretchers. The officer helped John to his feet. Didn't get enough action in Vietnam. Ha, he joked. John laughed, though it hurt. Apparently not. All I wanted was a beer with some friends. Well, this young lady will take you to the ER. Hand over your keys and my partner will drive your truck home. I'll pick him up after we're done at the hospital, the cop said. And stay away from this area, it's not like it used to be. Regulars hang out at Rockwood now, on the other side of town. Thanks, officer. I'll remember that, John replied. He followed the woman, who introduced herself as Amelia Simmons, to her small Dodge Dart. Aren't you the guy who got the Silver Star in Vietnam? She asked as they headed to the hospital. Yeah, he replied. How'd you know that? It's been all over the news today, she said. But what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at home with your wife or something? John couldn't hold back his emotions and began to cry quietly. He couldn't decide what hurt more, Julie's betrayal or the kindness of strangers who seemed to care more than she ever had. I'm sorry, Amelia said, glancing at him. I didn't mean to upset you. What happened? John gave her a brief account of his marriage's end, and she started to cry as well. Pulling into the ER parking lot, she found a spot and hugged him tightly. That's awful, she said. She doesn't deserve you. With tears streaming down her face, she asked, Why are you crying? Those men were going to hurt me, maybe worse, she said, her voice breaking. But you stepped in when you could have died. You didn't even know me, yet you risked your life for mine. I can never repay you for that. John hugged her back. You don't owe me anything, he said gently. No, I do. I owe you everything, she insisted. You saved my life when you were already hurting. I'll do the same for you, no matter how long it takes. I'll help heal your broken heart. I promise no one will hurt you like that again. You don't even know me, John replied. And you didn't know me either, she said, but after tonight I know all I need to. John Harkness, you're my hero, my knight in shining armor. Let me care for you, fill that emptiness. John considered her words, meeting her gaze. He saw only sincerity and warmth in her eyes, with no hint of deceit, something he hadn't seen in a long time. He thought of Harker's voice echoing in his mind, urging him forward. John smiled, though Amelia didn't understand why. Okay, he said, kissing her gently. She hugged him tightly. You won't regret this, John. I promise. They walked into the emergency room together, where the officer was waiting. While the doctor examined them, he cleaned John's wound and took X-rays. After reviewing them, the doctor looked at John and remarked, You must have a jaw made of steel. Amelia was fine as well, and John provided his account of the night's events, with the officer seeming satisfied. The officer glanced at John, saying, Amelia's a good person, but she's had a tough time. Her parents died in a car accident a few years ago, and she's been on her own ever since. Her last boyfriend was abusive, but she managed to leave him. Now she's homeless, living in her car for the past 3 days. I know you have your own challenges, but maybe you could lend her a hand. Who knows, maybe you both could help each other out. Thanks, John replied. Maybe you're right, he was surprised by what the officer shared. Amelia hadn't mentioned any of her struggles, yet she'd been there, offering him comfort. He felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in a long time, maybe love, or at least something far better than what Julie had given him. The officer handed him a card. Call me if you need anything, he said before heading over to Amelia. Follow me to John's place, I need to pick up my partner anyway, he instructed, and she nodded before they left the ER. The drive to John's house was quiet. John's mind was racing. His soon-to-be ex-wife had treated him terribly, he'd lost his Marine comrades, and now there was Amelia. He didn't believe in coincidences, but he couldn't help wondering. They were both hurting, yet each had put their pain aside to support the other. When they finally reached his home and the officers left, John invited Amelia inside. It's all right, Amelia, I don't bite. It's a lot more comfortable in here than your car, he said. I don't want to impose, she responded hesitantly. John grabbed one of her bags from her car. Nonsense, he insisted. It's no trouble. I have a spare room, and it's definitely safer than a rest stop. Okay, you're probably right, she agreed. Once they got her settled in the guest room, John invited her into the living room and offered her coffee. She accepted, sinking into the couch. As they drank their coffee, they exchanged stories. John opened up about his marriage and his time in Vietnam, while Amelia shared her past. She told him that her parents, though hard-working, had always struggled financially. They passed away in a car crash, leaving her with nothing. She sold what little she had, but soon found herself on the streets. The small savings her parents left behind went toward covering their funeral expenses. After losing her job as a secretary when her boss moved, she found work as a waitress at a diner near where she was attacked. She made enough to share an apartment with a friend, but when that friend relocated, Amelia couldn't manage the rent on her own. She dated briefly, but when the man turned violent, she chose to leave and return to living in her car, hoping to save up enough for a room. "Why don't you stay here?" John suggested. "I can't take advantage of your kindness like that," she replied. "I can't pay rent, and it wouldn't look good with your divorce going on." "It's not a problem," John assured her. "You can use the spare room, and maybe you could help me keep the place tidy. As for the divorce, if anyone asks, I'll just say I offered you a place to stay in exchange for some help around the house." "That sounds fair," Amelia said. "I hope you don't get tired of me." John chuckled. "I doubt it," he replied. "I just hope you can stand looking at this scarred face," he joked, pointing to his injury. She gently touched his scar and ear. "I can handle it," she said softly. "Actually, it makes you look tough, like someone who doesn't take crap from anyone." John smiled. "Flattery will get you far," he said. "By the way, things might get a bit crazy here for the next few days. Julie and her boyfriend are getting served with papers tomorrow morning, so I expect calls starting around 9 a.m. I also have some errands to run. Care to join me?" "Of course," she said. "I've got a few days off." "Well, I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted and my leg's aching. I'm heading to bed," John said. "I'll come with you, if that's okay," she said, following him down the hall. "Do you mind if I sleep next to you tonight? No funny business, I just need someone to hold me." "Of course," he answered. "I promise to behave." She smiled and headed to the bathroom to shower and change. By the time she returned, dressed in a long t-shirt and underwear, John was already under the covers. She slipped into bed, and he instinctively wrapped his arms around her. She rested her hand on his chest and her head on his shoulder. John couldn't remember the last time he felt so at ease. They woke up the next morning, still wrapped in each other's arms. John's hand rested on her bare chest, and he quickly pulled away, startled. "Sorry," he muttered. Amelia smiled at him, brushing off his concern. They got up, showered, and prepared for the day. While Amelia made breakfast, John dressed. At 9:20 a.m., the phone rang. "What the hell is this?" Julie shouted. "I don't want a divorce. And what's all this about cheating and abandonment?" "I don't care what you want," John replied coolly. "You moved out, refused to pay the bills, stole thousands from me, slept with Eric Swagman, moved in with him, and now you're pregnant with his child or someone else's. Does that clear things up?" "I didn't know you were back, John, or I would have come to you," she insisted. "That's nonsense. It's been all over the news. Strangers welcomed me home, but you were too busy with your affair to bother about your own husband," he said. "You don't understand, John. I still love you," she cried. "No, you don't, Julie. I haven't heard from you since last year. I found out everything from my parents when they visited me in the hospital after I got shot. You couldn't even send a card. How can you claim you love me when you're carrying another man's child?" "But I love you, John," she repeated. "No, you don't," he shot back. "What did you tell him when you talked about me raising his kid?" "How do you know what I said?" she asked, her voice breaking. She'd never heard him speak to her like this. "Just sign the damn papers and be done with it. We're over, and I'll make sure your boyfriend goes down with you," John replied. Suddenly, Eric took the phone. "Listen, you piece of crap, I'll bury you," he threatened. "I don't think so, moron. Tougher men than you have tried, and they ended up 6 feet under. You want to go up against me? You'll be begging for mercy. I heard your plans to burn my house and mess with my truck. Try it, and you'll regret it. You'll be lucky not to end up in prison," John warned. "We'll see," Eric retorted before Julie came back on the line. "John, please, let's talk this through. There's no need for a divorce. Eric and I have a proposal for you, she said. If you want to talk, speak to my lawyer, John said. Here's my proposal, go to hell and die. He slammed the phone down and punched the wall. Damn it, he yelled. Amelia hurried over and wrapped her arms around him. It's okay, John. She had it coming. And so did he. Let your lawyer handle this. That's what he's there for. Calm down. Please, she urged. How can she claim she loves me after all she's done, John asked, his voice breaking. I don't know, John, Amelia said softly. It's clear she's not in her right mind. But didn't you say we had things to do today? Let's get going. You're right, he said, regaining his composure. What's first on the list, she asked. I need to visit my civilian boss, get my dress uniform dry cleaned, and have the medals pinned on it, he replied. John planned to buy parts for the truck and do some maintenance. Let's get to it, Amelia said. We've got a busy day, but I'll call my lawyer first, John added. Amelia agreed, and he called Mike to update him about Julie's earlier outburst. Yeah, I figured she'd freak out, Mike responded, adding that Swagman had looked ready to lose his temper too. I'll be interested to see what they come up with. By the way, Lee's meeting with the senior partners this afternoon. Also, make sure your dress uniform is ready, trials next Friday. Got it, thanks, Mike, John said. I'll take care of it today. I'll call if anything else comes up. They left the house, dropped off John's uniform and medals at the cleaners, and gave detailed instructions for handling them. The owner, a fellow veteran, assured them he knew how to do it right. Then they headed to Wilkins' auto shop. Hey, boss, John called as he and Amelia walked in. Wilkins glanced up from a pile of paperwork. Well, look who it is, Wilkins said. Damn, I need a secretary. I don't have time for all this paperwork, I've got cars to fix. John looked at Amelia. Seriously, you need a secretary? Absolutely, Wilkins replied. I've got too much paperwork, phones ringing off the hook, and customers to deal with. John smiled. I know someone who used to be a secretary and might be interested. Amelia, how about it? Wilkins looked her over. Think you can handle all this, young lady, he asked. I sure can, Amelia nodded. I type 50 words a minute, sort documents, take shorthand, work with customers, and run the cash register. Wilkins thought for a moment. You working anywhere right now, he asked. Yeah, I'm waitressing, but it doesn't pay much, she replied. Here's the deal, give your boss 2 weeks' notice, then come work for me. I'll start you at $125 a week, since you're John's friend. How does that sound, Wilkins offered. That sounds wonderful, thank you so much, Mr. Wilkins, she said with a smile. Know anything about cars, he asked. Not as much as you, but my dad taught me a lot, she answered. Even better, Wilkins replied, turning to John. Oh, I've got something for you, he said, pulling an envelope from his desk and handing it over. John opened it to find a check for $2,340. He shook Wilkins' hand. Thanks, boss. This means a lot. You've earned it. Now go deal with that cheating wife of yours, then get back to work, Wilkins said with a grin. It's on my list, Boss John replied with a smile, as Wilkins waved them off. As they left the shop, Amelia looked at John in awe. Wow, $125 a week. I've never earned that much. Thank you again, John. You're welcome, John replied. Did you know that's almost double what I make as a sergeant in the Corps? Really, Amelia asked, surprised. Oh yeah, John said. So you really know your way around cars? Yeah, my dad taught me how to do tune-ups, change belts and tires, and even handle oil changes. We couldn't afford a mechanic, so he fixed everything himself, she explained. Better not let Wilkins hear that he'll have you working under every car in the shop, John teased. Amelia laughed. I wouldn't mind getting a little grease under my nails. You handle the truck, and I'll show you what I can do, she said with a wink. John grinned. Damn, I think I'm falling in love. Amelia giggled and kissed him on the cheek. Me too, she whispered. They stopped at John's bank, where he deposited the check, set aside 10% for savings as usual, kept $100 in cash, and ordered new checks without Julie's name. After that, they went to the auto parts store for everything John needed for the truck. After picking up burgers, they headed back home. Home, John thought. With Amelia by his side, it finally felt like home. He parked in the garage and started prepping for the work while Amelia changed clothes. When she returned in old jeans and a t-shirt, she asked, "What's the plan?" John handed her the spark plugs and wires. "You do the spark plugs and wires while I handle the oil change," she said confidently. "Okay," John replied, surprised. "You know how to check the spark plug gaps." "You're joking, right?" she said, gathering the tools and getting to work. John was impressed by how smoothly she handled the tools. He focused on the oil change while she replaced the plugs, wires, rotor, and distributor cap. When he finished, he checked her work and was genuinely impressed. Everything looked perfect, though John knew appearances could be deceiving, so he lowered the truck and started the engine. It purred smoothly, just as he had hoped. He revved the engine, listening for any issues, but heard none. Pleased, he turned off the engine and looked at Amelia, who had oil smudges on her hands and face. In that moment she seemed more beautiful to him than Julie ever had. "Well?" she asked, a bit nervous. John cupped her face with his dirty hands and kissed her. "Now I know for sure I'm in love," he said. "You're hired." Amelia smiled, not minding that her face was even messier now. John handed her some hand cleaner. He remembered wishing Julie would join him for moments like this, but she had always found his work too dirty. After cleaning up, Amelia prepared dinner, and they spent a quiet evening watching TV. For the first time in a long while, John felt content, not thinking about his soon-to-be ex-wife. The next few days flew by. John picked up his uniform from the dry cleaners and spent hours removing loose threads, polishing his boots, and shining his cap visor. Amelia resigned from the diner, only to be fired on the spot, but she knew she'd have to return for her last paycheck. As time passed, John and Amelia grew closer. They both decided to wait until John's divorce was finalized before deepening their relationship. It was tough for John. He hadn't been with a woman in a long time, but he knew he was falling for Amelia, and she felt the same. Finally, the court date arrived. After breakfast, John showered, shaved, and dressed, then joined Amelia in the living room. She looked stunning in a beautiful dress. "Wow," she said, admiring him in his full dress uniform with all his medals. "You look good enough to eat." John smiled. "Thanks, but I feel like a Christmas tree. You look amazing too," he added. At the courthouse, they were met by 14 uniformed Marines from John's unit, including Lieutenant Colonel Johnson and Sergeant Major Roberts. After introductions, they headed inside, where the Marines filled 2 rows of seats. John joined his lawyer, Mike, at their table, while his parents sat with the Marines. John glanced over at Julie and Eric at the other table. Julie's eyes widened at the sight of the man she had betrayed, while Eric sat smugly, his hand resting on Julie's pregnant belly. Julie hadn't yet noticed Amelia. The judge entered, and the bailiff instructed everyone to stand. Once seated, the judge noticed the Marines and asked, "What brings you here today, gentlemen?" Lieutenant Colonel Johnson stood. "Your Honor, we're here to support Sergeant Harkness and, if necessary, testify to his character." The judge smiled. "Thank you, Colonel. I don't think that will be needed, but I appreciate the gesture." The Marines remained silent but kept their stern gazes on Julie and Eric throughout the proceedings. As Mike had predicted, the case went smoothly. The judge questioned both John and Julie about their marriage and the events leading up to the divorce. Julie admitted to leaving John, failing to pay the bills, and becoming pregnant by Eric Swagman, who then absurdly demanded child support from John. "Do you seriously expect me to order Mr. Harkness to pay child support for a child you fathered?" the judge asked, disbelief in his tone. "Are you serious or just foolish?" He rejected every one of Swagman's requests. In the end, the judge ruled in John's favor, granting him the house, issuing a permanent restraining order, denying child support, and ordering Julie to return half of the money she had taken from their joint account. She was also directed to revert to her maiden name, but no wedding rings needed to be returned since she had already discarded them. Swagman attempted to object, but the judge silenced him with a firm strike of the gavel. "As for you, Mr. Swagman," the judge continued, pointing his gavel, "I'm ordering an investigation into your involvement in this matter. At a minimum, there is a significant conflict of interest here, and the district attorney is considering additional charges, including conspiracy. Swagman's face reddened as the judge added, "Your actions today will carry weight in any further proceedings. Mr. Harkness's divorce is granted." Swagman leaped up, fuming. "You fool, I'll have your ex and any other woman you're with, and I'll bury you." John remained composed. "I don't think so," he responded calmly. Swagman scanned the room, his rage meeting the stern expressions of the Marines and John's unyielding demeanor. Julie averted her gaze, her head bowed in shame. Before Swagman could continue, the bailiff stepped in, placing a firm hand on his shoulder and guiding him back to his seat. John shook his head as Swagman slumped, defeated. Lee Marcus, who had been observing from the back of the courtroom, approached. "You're fired," he told Swagman bluntly. "I'll also be filing a formal complaint with the bar. Pack your things and leave by the end of the day." Swagman clenched his fists but remained silent as Lee turned to Julie. "Julie, you're still employed for now, at least until after the baby. Then we'll re-evaluate your position." Julie nodded silently as Lee turned to John. "Sergeant, thank you for your service," Lee said, shaking John's hand. "On behalf of the firm and our board, I apologize for everything you've been through." John nodded, his gaze still on Julie. Lee then addressed Mike. "Considering the situation and John's service, the board accepts your initial proposal. No need to prolong this or waste more time or money. Let's finalize everything next week." Mike nodded. "Thanks, Lee. I'll be in touch on Monday." As Lee left, John turned to Amelia, who had watched quietly. She embraced him tightly, and he found comfort in her presence. When they parted, John noticed Julie watching them, tears in her eyes. "John, I'm so sorry," Julie said, her voice unsteady. "I never meant to hurt you." John's tone remained cold. "Well, you did." Julie wiped her eyes. Why did it have to end like this? "You weren't there for me, Julie." Eric was. "You saw dollar signs and made your choices. Now you live with them," John replied. Julie's voice trembled. "What's this about you raising my baby?" John's expression hardened. "Eric thought I'd raise your child while you stayed with him. It's absurd." "I didn't like the idea, but I thought about it," Julie admitted. "I'm sorry." John just shook his head. Julie then noticed Amelia and realized who she was. "I see you've moved on," she said bitterly. Amelia stepped forward. "I'm not just taking your place. I'm here to heal the heart you broke, and I intend to keep doing that for the rest of my life." Julie looked down. "I guess I deserve that." John's tone softened, though still laced with hurt. "Julie, do you think we can ever be friends?" "I don't know. I don't deserve your forgiveness," she replied, eyes filled with regret. John sighed. "It'll take time. If it weren't for Amelia and my parents, I don't think I'd be standing here now." Tears streamed down Julie's face as she left, and John felt a mix of sorrow and relief as he watched her go. He turned to Mike, shaking his hand. "Thanks for everything, Mike. I owe you." Mike waved it off. "That's what friends are for. Besides, putting Swagman in his place was satisfying. Now go celebrate, you've earned it." After thanking the Marines, John and Amelia left the courthouse where his parents were waiting. His mother hugged him tightly. "We're so proud of you, son," she said, then turned to Amelia. "And who is this lovely young lady?" John introduced Amelia, and his parents warmly invited her to dinner. "We want to get to know the woman who makes our son so happy," his mother said. "I'd love that," Amelia replied. The weeks that followed marked a new beginning for John. With the divorce behind him, he felt free to move on. He and Amelia grew closer, and one evening, after receiving the final decree, John proposed. Amelia accepted, and they married shortly after in a Marine sword ceremony. They continued working at Wilkins' shop, although they no longer needed the income. When Wilkins passed away in 1980, he left the shop to John. John stayed in the Marine Reserves, eventually retiring as a staff sergeant in 1992, a year after returning from Operation Desert Storm. Though memories of his Vietnam comrades still haunted him, he learned to cope, just as his father had. John and Amelia ran the shop together until they retired in 2008, passing it down to their two sons. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm until one evening, years later, when John noticed a tattoo design in a parlor window. It was a rose, similar to one he had seen in Vietnam with space for a name. On a whim, John led Amelia inside. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I almost got this tattoo with Julie's name back in Vietnam," John explained. "Now I want yours, above my heart, where it belongs." Tears welled up in Amelia's eyes. "But why?" she asked. "Because you healed my heart, and I want everyone to know how much I love you," John replied. The tattoo artist looked at John, skeptical. "You sure, old man?" John chuckled as he took off his shirt. "Absolutely." Amelia held his hand tightly. "Won't it hurt?" she asked. "Yeah, like hell," John grinned. "But it'll be worth it." As the needle buzzed to life, John smiled, knowing that the pain was nothing compared to the love he had found.